We all know that there is a conflict between Ukraine and Russia. Why this conflict now? What brought that about?
That's precisely the argument that Vladimir Putin has used to say that, we're just one and the same people. And that's exactly what he used when he announced the war in 2022, essentially saying that there should not be a separate nation called Ukraine or Ukrainians. We're one and the same.
What errors did Ukraine make that has brought us to this point?
First of all, on the level of preparedness, I think Ukrainians underestimated just in the months leading up to the war that it was real. Very few, you could have asked our president, I'm pretty sure Zelensky himself did not believe it would happen.
Looking at those two men and their characters, and here I'm talking Putin, Zelensky, do you ever see a world where they can sit down in a room and hash out an agreement?
Probably not. I'll just be point blank, and both sides have boxed themselves in when it comes to that. Putin has said that, he considers Zelensky illegitimate and not up to his stature. And Zelensky himself, also, to be quite honest here, in the first months of war, signed into law whereby
it's illegal to
engage in peace negotiations with Putin personally.
This is the very, very best. I introduce the very, very next. Big deal. You know this is the big league. Sanga mumihanda ya Kigali make a big fish. Word on the street turakaze. Habari gani mumeze mte. Yute shimi mana kuva honda muchiye. If you want the long form, come close mrabure. Wait, what?
The long form.
What did he say?
The long form.
What?
The long form.
The long form. The long form. Hello there. My guest this week on the Long Form podcast is Peter Zalmayev. Currently on a tour of the world, Peter, a Ukrainian-American journalist and political commentator, is the director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative, an NGO dedicated to the promotion of democracy in former Soviet territories. In this week's conversation, we discuss the true genesis of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, figure out how normal people deal on the oncoming Russian missiles in Ukraine, and debate what drives the war's protagonists, Volodymyr Zelensky and Vladimir Putin. We also attempt to predict the likelihood of Donald Trump forging a negotiated peace. Before we jump into today's episode, I want to make a deal with you. About 69.5% of you who watched this very podcast haven't hit the subscribe button yet. So here's the deal I want to make with you. If you hit that subscribe button today, I promise you that my team and I will keep making the show better and better in every single way. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button today. And now, let's get into the show. Peter, welcome to the Long Form. Welcome to Kigali.
Pleasure to be here.
You're the very first Ukrainian I've ever met. And that's crazy because you're a population of how many million people?
Well, officially it's probably 40, but now with the occupation and some millions being outside, it could be anywhere from 30 to 35.
Yeah. I'd like to start with a question about, the genesis of everything. Conflict never starts randomly. At least that's the lesson that I've learned here in Central Africa, right? So very often what we'll see in the media is something that's been brewing for 20, 30, 40, 60, even 100 years. And I'm pretty sure it's the same back home. It's not something that we're just seeing today. It's not something that just started in 2014. It's not just something that started in 2004. Very often in conflict, one thing follows the other. One miscalculation follows another miscalculation, and then eventually one bullet follows another. We all know that there is a conflict between Ukraine and Russia. That's not necessarily news. We're seeing it in the news all the time. I'm more interested in understanding what has brought the two sister nations to conflict, These are people who had been intermarried for probably centuries, have fundamentally the same Christian faith, were once part of the same USSR, the old Russia. Why this conflict now? What brought that about?
Very complicated issues, of course, and I think when you're referring to these long routes, right, that connect the two peoples, that's precisely the argument that Vladimir Putin has used to say that, we're just one and the same people, and that's exactly what he used when he announced the war in 2022, essentially saying that there should not be a separate nation called Ukraine or Ukrainians. We're one and the same. And in his interview about a year ago with Tucker Carlson, you may have seen that, he went into this very kind of abstract reasoning, going back to 300, 400, 500 years ago, talking about that. And I think that's where he lost a lot of the audience, because when you go and that deep, obviously, then you can pretty much discount any nation's right to exist as an independent nation, right? We were all parts of empires before. There are very few nations who have existed in this current borders for more than, let's say, 100 years, right? So that's just, kind of addressing that issue as a very spurious kind of argument to make. Apart from that, you're right. Russia and Ukraine are connected on many different levels. But in a way, if we take the historical argument, is to say that who has the primacy here? And Russia is a predominant power in the region, and especially during the Soviet days, calling the shots, and Ukraine being the second junior partner in the whole country of 15 republics. Ukraine would be a second most important one, but a junior partner. After this policy of Russianization, etc., one may think that Russia and Ukraine are just one part and the same, but you have to also understand that all these generations and decades and generations have passed where they obliterated a lot of the Ukrainian identity that we had. And the argument is that Ukraine actually has cultural primacy in a way. Ukraine, in fact, is the cradle of this Eastern Slavic, Eastern Orthodox civilization, Kiev being the oldest town, much older than Moscow. And so if you want to take the historical argument, you can say that Vladimir Putin, especially after being bottled up during COVID, and there's an argument to be made that his intensity, his obsession with Ukraine kind of got deeper as he was sitting, in a bunker deep underground, away from people.
Let's keep it within what we know, right? So that's
right. Yes, maybe a bit speculative, but he's been reading. We know, and he's been quoting various different thinkers, including those I would characterize as fascists, a version of Russian fascism, if you will, that actually negate a separate Ukrainian identity. And they think that unless Russia is able to recapture Kiev, it can never be great again, you see? And I would say that after the Soviet Union broke up, as a matter of fact, I don't think Russia ever took Ukrainian independence seriously. And Putin actually said it to George Bush, the George Bush Jr., meaning George W. Bush, that George, Ukraine is not even a country. That's literally his, quote. And so I don't think that Russia ever seriously thought that Ukraine would go a completely separate, independent way, even though it became an independent nation in 1991. Russia never thought it would let it go too far. And then when, after these revolutions, I think you very astutely alluded to both very signal years in our recent history, 2014, that is the start of the recent hostilities, right? The Euromaidan, the revolution in 2004, that was the Orange Revolution, right? And so when that happened, I think Putin had second thoughts about, you can't just let it continue going like this. You have to take matters into your own hand. Which is to say that the Russian elite never really seriously thought that they would allow Ukraine to go fully independent. Then you can make all these sorts of arguments that why does Russia consider Ukraine's independence as scary, as a threat to itself?
I don't think it's the independence, it's Ukraine's choices as an independent nation.
Precisely. A choice to be allied with, let's say, Western powers, right? Because also you have to consider that Ukraine is not a monolith. Ukraine is a multi-ethnic and I would even say multilingual country. Half of Ukraine, and actually that's the part I come from. I come from the Russian-speaking part of Ukraine. I grew up speaking Russian and only learned Ukrainian in the past 5 years. They are related languages, but still separate languages, etc. So the western part of Ukraine has always gravitated towards the West. It was never part of the Soviet Union for as long as the other part was, and was only annexed after the, a pact with the Nazi Germany that Stalin made, right, etc. So there's been that gravitational pull towards that, and especially after 2014, Ukrainians made a choice to be with Europe that Putin was very uncomfortable with. He considered the revolution is illegitimate. He considered that the Ukrainians kicked out a legitimately elected president, Yanukovych, etc. And so he felt that if he were to allow that to happen, that would be a serious blow to Russia's prestige in the region, to its credibility. And that's when the Crimea happened, the start of the war in eastern Ukraine, my hometown. And then when Zelensky came to power in 2018, Putin was actually hoping and expecting that he would be a much more pliable partner. He was a weakling, he was just a comedian, etc. And when he saw that it was not happening his way, when he saw that he's not getting what he wanted, and as essentially a control over Ukraine's foreign policy, etc., he went to war with Ukraine. He feels that his clock is running out. He is not a young man anymore. He's in his early 8th decade, 73, I think. He wants to enter history books as a reuniter of Russian land, sort of like Peter the Great. He's alluded to that on many occasions. But the problem is that Ukraine was never Russia's enemy. And it's almost like, if you ask me, I think the Russians or Putin has willed it into kind of existence. He's willed Ukraine to become the other, the bogeyman, against which to build his very ideology recently.
I hear and I understand where you're coming from. Obviously, you're talking about the Russians' responsibility in the conflict. Again, I truly believe that there's always responsibility on both sides, right? Where do you see Ukraine's, and I know it's a hard question to ask, right? You're in the middle of war, and no one really wants to hear, okay, what could we have done differently? Because you can choose to be right and say, you know what, I'm standing on a right, but when I'm seeing children dying, is there anyone who's right in that conversation? Very often, you can call Putin a madman. Okay, let's even assume that. But I wonder if there was an understanding of the level of threat that this so-called madman had. Again, we've talked about 2004, we've talked about 2014. I'm sure that we can even go to the fall of the USSR, and we can talk about the choices that were made, or the quote unquote the promises that were made to the new Russian administration from NATO and whatnot. I would kind of want to hear from you. We've heard from the Russian side. What did Ukraine do? What errors did Ukraine make that has brought us to this point? Because no one's perfect. I'm really interested in that aspect of the conflict.
I think you can look at it from many different ways. First of all, to address the issue of there's the madman theory of history, and that was pioneered by Richard Nixon, and then Donald Trump has been an adept of that. It's been ascribed to the way Putin does things. I think Putin is actually hyper rational. I don't think he's a madman. He acts kind of madly, but that's not to say that he's insane. In fact, he's acted rationally. He's been able to consolidate his power. He's still alive and in power, and he's got more power than ever before. And he's rich. I mean, you cannot even estimate how many hundreds of billions of dollars he may be worth, right? So it seems like he's done everything right, at least for himself. So why would he be a madman, right? Now, to your point about maybe you can even look at it like, had we gone into ahead with the same series of steps, right? Had we known how it would have ended up, right? One of the great unanswerables: woulda, shoulda, coulda. It's hard to say, and it's a hard conversation to have. First of all, on the level of preparedness, I think Ukrainians underestimated, just in the months leading up to the war, that it was real. Very few, you could have asked our president, I'm pretty sure Zelensky himself did not believe it would happen. I mean, let's look at his speeches, his people in his immediate surroundings, his secretary of Security Council at that time. The Americans were like screaming at us, like, it's happening. Look at what's happening around the borders. They're ordering body bags to the tune of tens of thousands of body bags, right? They're preparing. It's like a preparedness level A, right? Orange alert, whatever you want to use, whichever analogy. We did not believe that would happen. I mean, I know people who did. I knew Ukrainians who knew it from the get-go, from the beginning of the the breakup of the Soviet Union, the beginning of the independent Ukrainian, early 90s, who said Russia will eventually come back and try to gobble us up. So level of preparedness was not there. And if Ukrainians, had been smart about this, that, they would have prepared differently. They would have done everything in their power to make it too costly for Russia for Putin to even contemplate invading Ukraine. I know that may not be answering a question you're looking for deeper, right, and longer term time span here, but just for the immediate purpose of why this war happened, Putin did not feel Ukraine was ready. Putin did not think Ukraine was prepared to withstand this sort of onslaught. That's also a separate topic for conversation, how Putin did not have fullness of information. That is to say, that's a comment about how unquestionable, undisputed leaders, read totalitarian leaders, authoritarian leaders, are surrounded by sycophants and yes-sayers, so they did not receive correct and accurate information. So maybe he would have done things differently had he known that Ukrainians would have actually put up a fight.
So other than being unprepared a couple of months before the eventual invasion, there was nothing that Ukraine could have done or the Ukrainian leaders over the last 20 years, there's nothing that they could have done to perhaps arrest what is happening today.
Yes, they could have or should have. I wish Ukraine had been a more unified country. And this is something, actually, without going into detail, the Rwandan experience following 1994, how it's become one nation. We had never engaged fully, and we never embarked on that nation-building project where Russian-speaking Ukrainians living in the East felt like they were living in the same country as folks living in Lviv, the Roman Catholic town in the West. You would travel from one part of Ukraine to the other and feel like it's two different countries, you see? And that was exploited later by the Russians, who actually went into Ukraine. One of the pretexts was to protect the Russian-speaking population. This is just to give you an example, right? A lot of rife corruption, obviously. Politicians were too busy stealing rather than making it a unified state that would be able to withstand this sort of aggression, you see? So, and then the dance with NATO, where there's also culpability that's shared by the Western powers, who at the Bucharest summit in 2008 officially promised Georgia and Ukraine membership in NATO, never really meaning it. And I'm talking specifically about former Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel. So that actually, you could say that it teased the Russian bear, while they never really meant it. So that left Ukraine in a very vulnerable position, neither nor. The Russians got this pretext that this is a do or die, this is existential for us, we cannot allow Ukraine to become a member of a hostile alliance, whereas our politicians also half-heartedly engage in this dance without...
Do you think that was a fair Russian fear?
The history does not bear it out, unfortunately. This is an argument that is used by the Russians abroad. We went in to prevent the expansion of a hostile alliance. Well, let's just look at the recent history. Donald Trump, in his dance with Putin recently, has said that, okay, you want this? We pledge solemnly, and J.D. Vance and everyone else in his administration, Ukraine will not be a member of NATO. So he actually got what he wanted. The question is then, Why didn't Putin stop the war immediately? If that's a fait accompli, if he's been promised that, why hasn't he ended it? So that means there's maybe a partial truth to that argument, and there's been a useful argument for propaganda purposes, but there's probably something larger than just that. As you've said, there's many different factors. You can never single out one, but the argument about NATO does not hold water precisely for that. Also, if Putin wanted to prevent the expansion of NATO, then his actions have led to that. 2 new members, as you know, joined NATO, the heretofore neutral Sweden and Finland, precisely because of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And also, finally, majorities of Ukrainians were against NATO membership up until 2014, when Putin, started with Crimea and everything else. So he actually, once again, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Putin willed NATO to become this kind of bogeyman, and he is responsible for why we are where we are with NATO membership.
It's a weird situation for me because, again, as an African, Russia, the idea of Russia is such it's not a positive, but it has pretty good PR. And so it's hard for me to ever be in tandem with NATO action. And there's something that I just wanted to ask, and again, how do Ukrainians feel, right? You're fighting for your life. You're getting support from, say, the Russian bear is saying that, you know what, we're trying to stop Ukraine from going into the Western orbit. Then on the other side, and they're coming at you hard. And then on the other side, the NATO and the US are giving you weapons to fight the Russians, but they're not giving you all the weapons you need. Do you not? Sometimes I look at this and I'm like, it almost seems like there's a game being played of high stakes gambling, and it's men, women, and children that are just being the chips that are being consumed. Do you not feel a sense of anger? I mean, you're American, you're Ukrainian American. Don't you feel a sense of anger that, you know what, we're not being given the means to finish this, but we're also being, there's a little level of, they keep giving you that just enough to keep fighting. Therefore, you keep fighting, obviously. As long as you have weapons, you will fight. Isn't there that unfortunate thing where you don't get enough to win, you don't get enough to lose, and therefore you just kind of stay in this never-ending, killing field? As an American, how do you feel about that? As a Ukrainian, how do you feel about that?
It's precisely what Ukrainians have been saying. I'll try to translate it from Ukrainian. You can say a horrible end or a endless horror. You choose between the two, because it's precisely, and this is exactly how Russian propaganda, Lavrov, started off. The first rounds of talks, half-hearted talks in March of 2022. You remember, a month into the war, and there were hopes that you could put a quick lid on it and kind of reach some kind of a ceasefire, and it never led to any. But Lavrov was saying that the West is fighting to the last Ukrainian.
Yeah.
And obviously everyone was pissed, this is propaganda. Boris Johnson stormed in, and apparently now we have the story that it was Boris Johnson who prevailed. It's like, fuck it. Can I say that?
Yeah, sure.
We will fight. And actually one of the, Ukrainian MPs now, sort of spilled the beans. And now we know that and I've interviewed Boris Johnson, know him personally. It seems like, and he's been the darling of, as the staunchest supporter of Ukraine, but it turns out now that he prevailed and he, let's fight. But precisely what Lavrov said is something that you now are hearing more and more in Ukraine itself, because you're absolutely right There was a moment when Ukraine went on the offensive in like first few months of the summer of 2022. We started liberating our territory, Kherson and Kharkiv. And if we had been given more weapons and more decisive sort of weaponry, we could have kicked out the enemy. They were on a run. I mean, there was a rout. They were just running. They did not expect this sort of offensive, precisely because Ukrainians were using the sort of Western weaponry against which Russia did not have an answer. Then they kind of knew how to disable HIMARS rockets, how to use radio to disable the drones, etc. So they actually learned. They were giving time to do it, precisely because the West never really had the guts to go ahead. You can say that it may have been a cynical ploy. I'm not sure. This is conspirology at this point, if you ask me. But at the very least, you can say that Russia has also masterfully used its nuclear blackmail. Of the Biden administration. The Biden administration was very wary that this could lead to a nuclear bust-up, of the entire planet.
That's the truth.
And Russia is the world's largest nuclear power. As much as Ukrainians want to say, like, ignore these risks, it's not going to happen. You hear that a lot. A rationally cold-minded political scientist sitting somewhere in Brussels would not be on the same page, right? They have to take into account all these different risks. So once again, there's many factors here involved. There's the fear of Russia, the Russian bear, the nuclear weapons, etc. You can conjecture, would have and early in the war, actually, there was a much even more real chance that Russia would have used that weapon precisely to hold off the Ukrainians, who are kind of on a march. Now Putin, I think, is settled in for the long haul. He feels that in this war of attrition, he will outlast the decadent, weak West. That's not even a country. Like Henry Kissinger said, remember, when I want to call US, I know who to call, Washington, White House. If I want to call Europe, who do I call? There's no such country as called Europe. We're coming back to the same old collective action problem of, many different players who stand to benefit or to lose from Russia's continued aggression if Ukraine should fall in two different degrees. You have the Baltic states, you have Poland, they're very up in arms about it, but then you have remote Spain and Portugal. I mean, what do they care? And that's precisely why there was this discord at the NATO summit. Trump has demanded that they bump up their expenditures to 5% of their GDP, and Spain was not on board with that. I mean, they don't feel that immediacy of the threat. So we have this fraying coalition. We have Donald Trump, who's actually throwing a monkey wrench into the wheel, right? And it's not so cut and dried now. If we're not so sure America's going to stick with us until the end. And that also leads me to the same questions, and will increasingly lead Ukrainians to ask the same very question. Have we been betrayed, right? Had we known this would happen, should we have proceeded in the same manner, right? Should we have relied on this sort of loose coalition, the Rammstein coalition of countries where every single one of them is an electoral democracy? You have Biden today, Trump tomorrow, right? You have Macron today, Le Pen tomorrow, God forbid. Alternative for Deutschland in Germany. Even in Poland, there are some pro-Russian parties raising their heads, etc. So very precarious moment, very thin ice, But the thinking in Ukraine is also that, as we say, if Ukraine were to stop fighting, now it would cease to exist. If Putin stopped fighting, the war would end. That's the only difference.
You've talked about democracy, and you're also a democracy advocate. So one could say that among the reasons for this conflict is the manner in which Ukraine flirted with Western liberal democracy, and what I'd call the entire US, like the entire Western system. I know there are many other different reasons, but that is one of them. You've been an advocate for liberal democracy of a Western nature. Looking at what's happening today, could there have not been a better way to manage Ukraine's cleavages outside the so-called democratic process?
That's a very good question, especially with the new dispensation in Washington, when we no longer know if America is the great promoter of liberal democracy around the world. It's an open question, and I have serious doubts about that. This is a very pertinent question, obviously. Whether that's the only model. I mean, I myself, as someone who grew up in the Soviet Union, who moved to America in 1994, I've been a beneficiary of open societies, of the ability to travel outside of your country, right? And have ease of travel and self-expression, all these things. As an attendee of Burning Man Festival, I'm not sure if you've heard it in Nevada. I mean, I like that sort of thing. I think a human being thrives the best in an environment like that. But liberal democracy has been questioned now quite severely, and in this
All over the world.
And especially in times of war, Russia is showing that it can withstand thousands of sanctions and continue waging this war, having lost 1 million people, according to Western intelligence estimates, dead and wounded, and up to 1,000 daily, and still continue staying in this war. It shows that the staying power of autocracies or dictatorships that is greater, maybe, than democracies, at least in a situation of war. So Ukrainians are also looking at that, and the longer this goes on, and the fraying coalition that we're seeing on the part of our Western allies, this will increase the yearning on the part of significant numbers of Ukrainians for that sort of, a model. Whereas, and precisely, we've seen that with our president. I'll be honest about this. I know a lot of my friends and colleagues in Ukraine who think that Zelensky is showing authoritarian tendencies, that he's tried, to get rid of the anti-corruption agencies, or get rid of the, or deprive them of their independence. You may have seen this, and that led to demonstrations out on the street, the first ones in Ukraine since the war started. And then he had to backtrack. So that's actually very real. When we say that when you fight the dragon, be careful not to turn into one. So all of a sudden, people are like, what are we fighting for? We're fighting Russia, and then our president is turning into a mini Putin. I think that's a gross exaggeration, but it's also a reality.
I'm more interested in the events of 2004, 2002, because
2022 or
no, 2002, 2004, and the Orange Revolution and everything that created the Orange Revolution. And so very often, one of the things that I've seen sometimes is that what we went through in Rwanda was, we understood that governance and bringing people in together sometimes is a better way forward than, one side wins, the other side loses. Throw in, and we had to figure out, okay, what's good for us as the Rwandan people, and put ourselves first, and then create something that worked for us, not because it came from open society or this model or that model. Do you think, because sometimes I look at things and I'm like, and I look at things that happen around the world and the different cleavages within a country, and I'm like, and I wonder to myself, does this have to be so? Does this governance model have to be what everyone fights for? And are we ready to pay the price for saying, you know what, if 51% of people agree to this, then we're going to ignore the 49. And I wonder whether, when we talk about liberal democracy and how it's been pushed across the world, whether it is a good model for a lot of nations. I look at Ukraine sometimes and I'm thinking, maybe there could have been better ways to bring everyone together rather than pull everyone apart.
Especially when this liberal democracy has been a cloak, a disguise for our politicians going back, throughout our independence, to just get away with murder, meaning get away with plunder of national wealth, grand-scale corruption, etc., all under the mantle of liberal Democrats, right? If you flirt with this, if that's what you the idea that you convey to people that this is what a liberal democracy is, they will grow disenchanted with it. They will want a strong hand. And so, and especially the longer this war goes on, in this current status, I mean, people will be looking across their shoulder. People will be looking at China. People will be even looking at Russia eventually. I mean, why can't we just stick to what really works? I mean, if this is your idea of a liberal democracy, I still think this is a personally this is a society I would personally choose to live in. But I understand how it is no longer feasible to be preaching this around the world when for wide swaths of the population in Western democracies, this isn't played out so well. We're talking about distribution of wealth. We're talking about hugely unequal societies, and also a strain on these Western democracies of various, groups of immigrants from other countries that a liberal democracy has no tools to deal with, right? It also goes back to the idea, I'm not sure if you've heard the paradox of democracy. It's a political economic concept where democracy is in paradox and in contradiction with itself, because by definition, it has to allow very undemocratic, but democratically elected powers, political forces to come to power, and it has to live with it. Because if you're a democracy, then you have to. So that's a self-contained paradox, and we're seeing it played out right now in Western democracies and elsewhere.
How you talked about how in two parts of the country, like in the side of Ukraine where you're born, it's very different. It had different economic outcomes than, say, the Western side that was a bit more Europeanized. Now, if you had been in a position of the presidency all those years back, and with the knowledge that you now know that the choices that we made back in those days has brought us to this point in history, how would you have tried to manage the two sections of the population?
It's a very difficult question, because the prescription you hear now is like, go back and try to make it a unified country, and I also mentioned it, right? But then how? Do you impose one language to the detriment of another language? And for a lot of people, the mother tongue is a mother tongue. It's the most sacrosanct thing, right? It goes beyond political identity. It's your mother tongue. It's the most sacred thing you have. It's the language your mom spoke with you as you were feeding on her breast, right? As a Russian speaker myself, I grapple with these issues. I have to be honest with you. I'm actually now on thin ice, because this is against the received wisdom that is precisely that why Ukrainians were allowed, since they were allowed to speak Russian, it has led to this. We have sort of ceded ground to the enemy, I, sort of break with my compatriots when it comes to this issue. It would not have been the correct way. You don't deprive anyone of their mother tongue, right? You have to find a way to live in one country with two languages. I've cited the example of Canada, no stranger to that society, how it's been able to coexist in two very different languages, English and French, and it's been successful. There's an argument to be made that with Ukrainian, they're more similar than French and English, right? The Russian, Ukrainian, if you start using Russian, it will soon dominate and obliterate Ukrainian, because Ukrainian would not be different enough. Let's say Romanian versus Hungarian. They also were part of this empire, but they're so wildly different than, Hungarian minority or Romanian minority within Hungary kept their language, etc. So there's this fear, and there's also this, phobia that it would not be the case. Once Russia were, allowed to Russianize Ukraine, it would be very hard to build up the same, nation, that existed before, let's say, or under different empires like Austro-Hungary, etc. So very different, very difficult question. What should have
what would you have
been done differently? I would not have, like I said, I would not have gone the authoritarian way. I would not have been banning languages, because it also goes against my idea of a liberal democracy, right? I would have been cracking down very harshly on corruption. That's the root of all evil, and that really undercuts all things that you preach to your citizens if what you're doing is just enriching your and lining on your pockets, enriching your family, etc. That undercuts everything. That breeds cynicism. If you had addressed that and it would have built a prosperous society, that would have been a society that I don't think any other neighboring country would have been so willing and lighthearted about trying to conquer or aggress against. Putin looked at Ukraine as just a sort of a Russia version light, a corrupt society, disunited, no ideas of patriotism. Well, he miscalculated, because that's the moment when you strike. This is when people mobilize. But it would have been a different society if, like I said, Ukraine had had not just preached these values of the West as we understand them, but had practiced them. And the main one is rule of law, anti-corruption, etc. And that didn't happen. We often, after this war started in 2014, and we lost Donbass, my hometown, and we signed this agreement with Russia, and we essentially ceded that territory. Our politicians consoled themselves by saying, let's look at this example of Croatia that was in the war with Serbia. 3 years, it took them 3 years. They lost territory to Serbia. 3 years, they built a successful society. They went back and they recaptured the territory because of who they became. So let's just work on our, build our house, strong, and we'll have our, revenge. We'll get back all the territory, etc. But it's not what happened. I don't think
Russia is not Serbia.
Russia is not Serbia. And 2014, I guess it was not the wake up call that we needed. We still needed the 2022 to get where we are now. And now that we are here, the question is, do our allies understand it as an existential moment for them? Our argument has been that if we fall, you'll be next.
We'll talk about that. I'd like to. You've been traveling around the world right now. You've been in Burundi. I saw your interview in Malawi on Malawi State News. You're from here. You're traveling to Uganda to kind of. You're trying to almost be a one-man trumpeter of the Ukrainian cause. I would like to ask you, when was the last time you were in Ukraine?
In September last year.
September last year. You were in Kiev?
Yes.
What's life there like?
Well, and I have to update this idea of what life is there like, because a lot has changed since I left in September. But just up to that moment when I left, it just shows you how human beings update their idea of normal and normalcy constantly. We adapt, and as macabre, as ridiculous as it sounds, with when you have ballistic missiles traveling at the speed of 4 kilometers per second at your city, right, and on a regular basis, and drone attacks, etc., you still have a maintenance and a semblance of normal life. We have a curfew that's at 12 o'clock. We have to be at home, but people, clubs
12
are
o'clock at night, midnight.
Huh?
You mean
midnight?
Okay.
But people still go about their daily life. I mean, we have people party. People have, and that's actually also led to resentment on the part of folks who are serving in the military. How there's this disconnect between the army and the civilians, and that brings resentment because there's a lot of people in Ukraine you'll meet that act like nothing happened. There are men on the streets, able-bodied men, who are avoiding being conscripted into the army. That's been a major issue as well.
Have you gone? What you're able-bodied?
I'm an able-bodied man. I have not. I decided that I'll be engaged in informational warfare, if you will. Yes, people ask me in the comments to my posts, like, why are you in Africa? Why are you like Don Quixote, waging war against windmills if you can actually go and fight? And, at the end of the day, I probably won't have a very satisfying answer. I mean, I am afraid of being killed. I mean, I'm not going to lie about this. I don't think I'm cut out to be a soldier.
But is anyone?
That's a good question.
Right? I mean, everyone, no one, very few men and women want to die. That's not a good outcome for anyone.
But it's a very good question, and I don't have a very satisfying answer. I mean, it's always a grappling with your own conscience, searching within yourself.
Do you have any family members who are on the front line?
Oh yeah. I mean, distant relatives, I would say, because a lot of my relatives are on the other side. They're on the other side of the divide, either in Russia
Mm.
or in the occupied territories, and some of them are in elsewhere in other countries.
When you say the other side, do you mean they're in the Russian army or
In
in Russia?
in Russia, and some of them have been pretty much of that persuasion. I wouldn't say brainwashed, if you will, whatever. Some of them remain, committed to the idea of no war. That's an anti-war stance in Russia gets you a prison sentence now. Saying no to war will get you into jail in Russia. So that's. I have a close friend, and you're seeing this right here. This is an army tactical bracelet. We have co-hosted a TV show with him since for 8 years, and he's a major in the Ukrainian army now. So he's my close friend. So a lot of close friends are in the army, and obviously, the longer this war goes on, the more everyone is affected. Now, everyone in Ukraine has people who have died.
You lose.
And the more friends you lose, and the difference, the crucial difference between Russians and Ukrainians. Putin has actually been able to benefit from I would even argue from the deaths of some of these men who are fighting. He has actually improved his the DNA of his nation, because a lot of these people being thrown into battle are from these very depressed, poor regions of Russia. A lot of them are just simple, busybodies who had nothing better to do, low education. I'm not being, I'm not demonizing people here, but, Russia is vast, and he's been able to recruit folks away from population centers to keep the protest level low. So people in Moscow and St. Petersburg are persona. I mean, they're like off limits. They're doing well. They don't feel the effects of war. And so he is recruiting these people from economically depressed areas. He's able to pay them up to $30,000 to sign a contract, something Ukraine cannot afford to. And Ukraine, considering we don't have that luxury of that vast population or money to pay, we've had people like prominent TV hosts, poets, actors, ballet dancers who have died in this war. That is a stark difference between the sort of quality of people dying.
Well, and African mercenaries. So let's
in Russia, you mean?
No, also in
But you heard the
Ukraine
story
as well.
about how a lot of Russians are now working at this drone factory in Tatarstan. I've actually met with people in African countries, including in Zambia. Reporters from the TV channels in Zambia have actually traveled to Russia to investigate the presence of African nationals in some of these military factories.
I think one of the things that happened and talking about Africans and their viewpoints on this war, one of the things that I think damaged Ukrainian, the way Africans looked at Ukraine and Ukrainians was what happened right after the first Russian attacks. When, before there were lots of African students studying in Ukraine, Ukrainian universities.
Yes.
There was a kids from Nigeria, kids from East Africa. I think probably also kids from Rwanda as well. And when the attack happened, people were trying to flee, right? And there were instances of Ukrainian authorities stopping Africans from getting on buses, getting on trains, and saying, you guys need to go to the front.
Really?
Yes. You should check that out. It was quite, and that kind of brought up this idea of, again, these are Nazis, Ukrainians are Nazis, they're racists, and this is what they're doing to these poor Africans. They're letting white people get out. Africans are being asked, yes. It was a BBC. It was on BBC. It was a big story.
It's not something you hear much about, in Ukraine,
obviously,
because there's no legal means to coerce foreign nationals to go into
that's
to the war.
So what I was trying to give you was how certain narratives were lost at the very beginning, and how some of people's ideas of who the bad guys are were instantly poisoned by the initial reactions to the Russian missiles. So you've never been. I was going to ask you. So you've never, obviously, you've never picked up a gun. You've also never been to the front lines.
No, I visited
What are they
once.
like?
I mean, it's deafening. I mean, apart from everything else, it's just the
You
amount
mean
of
like
stress.
loud?
It's loud, and it's such a. I mean, you spend one day at the front line, you have PTSD for the rest of your life, pretty much. It's your eardrums are just not used to or prepared for anything like that. This leaves you scarred for life, and it's very easy to die, obviously, with the cluster ammunition that's been used by both sides, etc. It's no joke. I had a prominent lady who was a prominent writer who, 2 years ago, she went like that. Just she thought she was well behind the front lines, and she was killed. It's very easy.
You've spent a bit of time helping us understand the man that Putin is in terms of his mindset. You say that he's ultra rational, but then he has this idea of a greater, becoming, Vladimir the Great, bringing together this reconstituting the Soviet Union in this century. What drives Zelensky, right? Like, he was, I maybe I'm wrong here. He was a comedian, somehow ended up in the in the presidency, and now he's in the fight for his life. What? And you see him, and I'm really interested to hear from a Ukrainian what drives him. How does his brain work? You've now brought up instances of him kind of starting to have an authoritarian tint to his leadership. What is your measure of the man?
I mean, he's a man actually physically of small stature, but then so is Putin. They're similar.
Napoleon complex.
Possibly. Paradox. I mean, you mentioned he was a comedian. Not only that, but the postmodernism of this story is tremendous. I don't think it's nowhere. We have maybe with Milei, the president of Argentina. Maybe Trump's presidency is also similar in that way that he played on The Apprentice show, right? He played a successful businessman, and then he became successful businessman in the minds of millions of Americans. And Zelensky, this is the most postmodernist, perfect story of all. He played a president, he played a teacher in a country school in Ukraine who decided to root out corruption, and he became president as a result of that. So that was
on TV.
Yeah, that was the TV story of the series that he played, and then he becomes the guy that he had played. This is truly amazing. The most unlikely person you would imagine who became president. Probably not someone who necessarily cut out to be president, just the way he speaks, something that you will not understand if you don't speak Russian or Ukrainian, but just to hear his accent and how he expressed himself, and that he didn't even speak Ukrainian very well when he became president, but he's actually come up through the ranks. So he's actually learned and grown into this role, but not a charismatic man, but not a natural politician. I don't think so. An accidental man in some ways who became the darling of the entire world. He became person number one. He was on the cover of, Time magazine, New Yorker magazine. I mean, I don't have to tell you. He's addressed by, online or directly, parliaments of dozens of countries around the world. It's like an incredible story. And I would not be cynical and to say that, well, he's become a statesman, whether you like him or not. And a lot of my friends are not big fans. I personally did not vote for Zelensky. I stay away from harsh criticisms of Zelensky, even though I allowed myself some comment because I'm also a commentator. I just was on BBC World News saying what I'm saying now about these protests and him showing some authoritarian feathers here and there. But he's become a statesman, and I think his life is linked with his survival is linked with the survival of Ukraine. I mean, he
Not
sees
really.
it.
I mean, he could. We've seen what happens with Assad, right?
Yeah. I mean, he would be granted,
He'll
but
probably go and live in Washington,
then, Sonny,
DC.
you and I, were you ever in power? Was I ever in power? We probably will never understand someone who has achieved this sort of power. And it's a different sort of power from Putin, for example, who actually has literal power of a vast country in the world, the biggest country, territory, area-wise. Zelensky became like he was master of hearts and minds of millions, of hundreds of millions of people around the world, right? It's the story of David versus Goliath. I mean, to have been in his skin, I don't think I can imagine. I don't think you can imagine what it's like and what it does to your psyche. You know, let's not forget that Zelensky came in his first office, his first term. He promised would be his first and last. He said, "I will not be reelected." Obviously, that's out the window. We are not holding our elections because the Constitution does not allow for the holding of elections during time of war. Something that Putin has actually been using against us to say that he's illegitimate because his term has run out, you know, right? But we say power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Just like any politician, and he's become one, he wants to probably cling to power because he does not see himself as living outside of politics after what he's been through. How do you go on and just become a regular citizen after having been person number one?
I'd like to ask, so looking at those two men and their characters, and here I'm talking Putin, Zelensky, do you ever see a world where they can sit down in a room and hash out an agreement?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and probably not. I'll just be point blank because, and both sides have boxed themselves in when it comes to that. Putin has said that he considers Zelensky illegitimate and not up to his stature, even though he has met with him. He met with him before the war, so he does not. I mean, only
he does not take him seriously.
Only to sign capitulation, yes, but not like on equal terms. And Zelensky himself, also to be quite honest here, in the first months of war. Signed into law, whereby
it's illegal
to engage in peace negotiations with Putin personally. So that also you can argue about, like now after the fact, you can argue about how useful that was. I mean, the history will bear it out. Will judge, but both sides have boxed themselves in, and that's also another reason why we are where we are at an impasse.
So what happens if both men cannot talk?
The war just goes on. These men cannot talk, more people die. I mean,
how many more people? You're Ukrainian. How long do you think? How many more years do you think you can fight?
The thing is, the math is not in Ukraine's favor. Let's put it bluntly. Simply because not only can Putin continue recruiting up to a certain point, he also has limits. We know that, but he's got a vastly. Okay, Ukraine has 30 million, Russia has 150, 5 times more. He's got more of these déclassés, these marginal elements of society, people who are willing to go and die for 30,000, and then you have 100,000 more paid up to the family in case of your death. So it's a good, it's a good thing to do for your family, to sacrifice yourself. That's sort of the equation. And he's got oil money; he can continue paying. That sort of, we don't exactly know how. Where the bottom is for him. When it will bottom out eventually, there's a limit to that. But he's also been able to recruit North Koreans, and apparently there's actually reports that now the Chinese nationals have been captured fighting on Russia's behalf. Up to 15,000 North Koreans fighting on Russia's behalf. Our Western allies are not showing the same willingness to send boots on the ground. So the math is against us. Eventually, if this is allowed to go on the way it is, and as you said it, it's not going to be in our favor. I'll just kind of leave it at that.
Speaking on Malawian TV, you said that if Ukraine falls, there'll be a domino effect. Now, very often when people talk about a domino effect, or, global domino effect, it's supposed to be shocking. Here in Africa, here in the global South, I'm not sure whether a domino falling is a bad thing. You're talking about keeping a certain global order, right? That, Putin is coming and destroying the global order. Xi Jinping will possibly change the global order. Trump is changing the global order. I'm Rwandan. I'm looking at the global order and thinking, this has never been good for us. This, from the get-go, just maybe, there might be a space where when the global north is busy fighting amongst themselves, there can be a little bit of wiggle room for us in the global south to grow.
Sunny, it's actually funny, but this is precisely the words I use. Precisely. I mean, I will back it up with, I'll show you if it airs on one of the TV channels here. Like literally an hour ago, I said that Trump cutting off USAID, there's rumors swirling around the continent that there will be closures of US embassies, right? He
No, I
will
know that.
consolidate. So actually, that is wiggle room to allow Africa to quit its cargo cultism, if you know what I'm talking about, right? And always looking up to the, forces, for dole outs, for help. And this is an opportunity to mature and grow up. I mean, this is exactly what I said. There's a flip side to it. And like you said, the fraying of the world order, it's not just it takes two to tango, as they say. With America sort of quitting this role of a promoter of liberal democracy, right, and denigrating openly Africa, right, as this administration in Washington has done, starting with the encounter with Cyril Ramaphosa in the Oval Office, and that followed the one with Zelensky. Very disrespectful, let's face it. And I mean, this administration is openly racist. Let's not mince words.
You mean
here.
the U.S. administration?
The U.S. administration, right? And we know Donald Trump has that streak, right? He does not respect Africa. I don't think he cares really, So in that, I mean, I understand the legitimacy argument. If that's sort of if these are if this is what's happening, how can you blame African countries from looking elsewhere? From considering other alliances.
I'm not even talking about the alliances in per se. I'm talking more about, look at it this way. Before, and I hate it because at the end of the day, they're real people, right? Sometimes when we sit down as commentators, as people watching the news, it almost becomes like a movie. Like we forget that someone can no longer walk because of this, because of actions, because someone's life is changing for good. It's not a game. But taking away from that very human element of conflict, what I see is, as an African, a journalist or a commentator, is, okay, I'm seeing Europe fraying because of this. Because Europe is fraying, they're reevaluating themselves, and also they're reevaluating their place in the world. I'll give you an example. Ukraine opened embassies in Africa. Why? Because of the war. Because all of a sudden, you needed us to be on your side in the UN General Assembly. You needed us to stop voting either for or abstaining.
Yes.
And that is a real effect. All of a sudden, we're seen as partners. I mean, there was also a challenge that, there was a group of African leaders who came at the very start of the conflict and to see if they could figure out a way forward. And that was a bit of a debacle. But we've seen what has happened. And as Africans, we're kind of on the periphery looking in, but enjoying the benefits of, all of a sudden, people want to have a sit down with us. All of a sudden, Ukrainians are traveling the continent, talking to media. So, again, when you talk about, the domino will fall, okay, domino is already falling. And perhaps it might fall in a way that is good for us. Not necessarily good for you, right? But am I wrong in thinking so realpolitik, or is it just a fact of the matter?
Well, I totally get your point, and I think it's quite logical. It's something I've grappled with, like precisely along the same lines that you've just delineated. A lot of these things will have to wait for their maturation, right? I mean, to see how they marinate and how they develop, and what sort of kombucha you will get, whatever you want to use, the brew that is happening in the African continent with once again the Western powers ceding positions, former colonial powers such as the French, the Brits, and through them the Americans. I'm talking about Niger, Mali, Central African Republic, Cote d'Ivoire, where powers have been powers have changed. There have been coups and military bases have been evicted, right? So Russia is now calling the shots in some of these countries, like Central African Republic, right? There's an argument to be made that this is cynical exploitation of the country's resources, right? Right before the war, the New York Times had a huge piece about Madagascar, about how Russia was the Wagner Group, Prigozhin was playing both sides in the elections, and they were essentially betting on each of the two sides contesting the election to come out the winner, whichever case. So you can take the cynical view that it will turn out to be the same old kind of exploitative colony versus colonizer versus colonized situation. But we'll just have to live to see how it develops. I think when I say the domino effect, and there's something to be said about what you said. Africa is in a position to be like, okay, we have Chinese visitors, and the Russians and Ukrainians, and Ukraine actually has not only just opened embassies, but it's invested in Africa by providing free grain from Ukraine, whereby Malawi, Zambia, and Madagascar are recipients of that. So they're clearly benefiting. And yes, I will say that this could also be looked at as cynically, like, well, it's just like, my only hope is that this stays, even if and when the war is over. Let's continue developing relations, and continue these programs regardless of the ulterior motive here. I mean, what else can I say? I think it's more for me an epistemological issue. Africa and everywhere else. I think Russia is playing a very dangerous civilizational role as the propagator of the idea of post-truth, and that's Timothy Snyder, the great Yale historian. He's now at the University, I think, of Toronto. Post-truth, the idea of post-truth. Russia has pioneered and actually employed various different techniques of information control, informational chaos, whereby obvious fakes are being, entered into the discourse.
I mean, I'm sorry, I cannot accept that.
Why not?
Because again, I'm African. There's never been truth. When you talk about post-truth, that is a very there has not been truth here, whether it's Western truth or
no.
The idea, again, it's one of those things where I've realized that, people they forget that Africa is watching, right? And Africa has been the recipient of Western so-called truth. Mm-hmm. And we've seen how narratives and lies and media push certain things. So when you talk about, Russia has done this, for us, it doesn't really resonate, because we're saying, well, that's
but
really how you.
But the idea, I mean, once people have fullness of information, at least is for them to decide that yes, Russia has done this, and the other. Russia has lied about this, the causes of war. Russia has obfuscated about the downing of MH17, which is obvious to all the world that it's behind the downing. But Putin would never, as an experienced KGB man, he's been trained never to acknowledge, his fault, right? So it's like a state program of lies, white lies, obfuscation, and active deception.
And that is normal. And that is how global powers do their thing.
Up until, the coming to power of Donald Trump, I would have viciously argued with you. It's like, it's not normal. It's not what the way the West operates, at least now in this post-colonial, right, kind of more enlightened fashion.
Some would say that Donald Trump is the true face. Is an honest face
he's like
of American power.
He called his network Truth Social, so I guess it has to translate into the truth. But precisely because Trump came back and he so decisively shuffled this deck of cards, I can no longer say that the distinguish between this kind of propaganda and lies and l'état c'est moi, and if I say it's the truth, it is the truth. This is where the two leaders, Trump and Putin, meet each other halfway. This is where they become part of the same kind of equation and the same side of the coin that I'm very uncomfortable with. having said all this, we are talking about differences of perspective, right? You said that,
I don't trust anyone.
I'm coming from my perspective, and I'm looking at these events and how Russia has demonized Ukraine, how Ukrainians have been demonized and painted very unfairly as Nazis and this, that, and the other. To me, it's obvious. But what you're saying is that even if African intellectuals or people who've bothered to learn about what's going on, they may just not be invested enough in it or care to like.
No, I think we care at a very human level. Now, what we maybe find, it's again, right now, we're talking about Ukraine. We often talk about what's happening in Gaza. Right now in Sudan, there is a war that's just unending. So for me as an African, I've decided to concentrate on what is important in my area. Right now, yes, I understand how media works. I understand how international media works. It highlights white faces, white victims. But I also do remember that there are wars that are closer to my borders. I mean, you've been to Burundi. And there's something brewing over there that's not very good. So it's not that we don't care as African quote unquote intellectuals. It's just that, one, it's a war that's happening over there. Two, I think that we're at least kind of seeing the inconsistencies, the idea of, the chickens coming home to roost. We're seeing, global power dynamics shift at a very human level. Of course, it's terrible. No one wants it. Like you're seeing these missiles falling on people, and it's terrible. But again, it's very hard for me to humanize you before I humanize someone in Sudan.
I just wanted, I think, all very salient points to which I will not have a satisfactory. I mean, I will not be. There will be no rejoinder. Like there will be no but. There's no but here. What you said is correct. And one of the leading Ukrainian intellectuals, Vitaly Portnikov, whom I'm friends with, I interview him on a regular basis. He's one of the most respected spokesmen of unpleasant truths to Ukrainians. He said, look at 1994 and what happened here. How many Ukrainians then or other Europeans cared? How many Ukrainians know about what's happening in the Sudan now? I mean, these are all rhetorical questions to which I will not have a good answer. What you're saying is quite legitimate. I mean, it's quite legitimate. It's a distance creates this sort of lack of, with the further, away you are, the less empathy you feel. I mean, these are just all realities. I don't want to go into platitudes about how we have to start acting as just one family of nations and care, but it's not going to happen. We understand that, the idea is at the end of the day is to, once again, to talk about these things, to try to build bridges and human bridges. When I go on, I mean, I've been able to stay in touch with local broadcasters from the island of Bougainville in Papua New Guinea. I mean, whoever from Ukraine ever visited the island. Namibia, the TV, Desert FM, for example, folks like that. SABC, Pretoria FM, folks continue to call on me to provide commentary. So in a way, like you said, as a trumpeter of Ukraine, all I can hope for is just to continue being engaged with these people, to share with them what I think about what is going on and have them make that decision. And I always make a serious preamble whenever I open my mouth that I'm not here to tell Africans who they should be or should not be friends with. When I was in Namibia, it had just concluded a nuclear power agreement with Russia. I mean, who am I to say they should not have done that, right? I do appeal to folks to vote their conscience when it comes to the United Nations. And apparently, Rwanda, being as neutral as it is in this conflict, has been admirable. I was very impressed how it's been able to maintain good relations with all sides, and still it voted to condemn the aggression at the United Nations. I think that's a worthy example.
I think at some very fundamental level, aggression is not good, right? I think at a I wish there could have been, and that's why I kept asking you about how could you have stopped this at the get-go? Because I do think that as you talk about the post-truth world, I do think that we're going to see more of these things happening. Social media is probably driving more cleavages within communities. The way the algorithm works, it highlights the most divisive rhetoric. We're seeing that in the US. We're probably going to see it in other countries as well. And
it's interesting. I just read a piece about the dysfunction of the Senate. And it's literally what you just said about how even senators now are victims of these algorithms, right? They stake out extreme positions and there's no middle ground.
And so if there is, I'd hope that the lesson of Ukraine is that we need, whether it's media, intellectuals, politicians, we need to actually understand the risks that are within our societies and not take it for granted that we can keep doing the same things. Because you are a great example, unfortunately, of if there isn't some kind of coming together, there will be a coming apart. I'd like to ask you the last question, and this is about your president. And in this case, I'm talking about Mr. Donald Trump. One of the things that worries me most about him is the fact that he's very transactional. And I've been hearing scary things about what the Americans want for their support. They're talking about, we want land. I don't know how much of this is true. It's just news reports like, they want for weapons, they want land. They're giving you weapons, but fundamentally it's on a loan. So eventually, even if you do win, you'll owe hundreds of billions
with
of
interest. With interest, yes.
You literally owe, after losing millions of people, you'll also owe hundreds of billions of dollars with interest to these guys. And they're also, like I said, I don't know, they're talking about mineral deals and land, and Ukraine has this amazing black soil that's can feed the whole world. When I tell you all these things, and you're obviously a clever man, you know these things, what are the chances that the US government can bring together a peace deal? And what are the chances that a US government led by Donald Trump, who is fundamentally transactional and honestly sometimes untrustworthy, what are the chances that there can be a deal that actually ends this killing? Or do we have to wait for the next administration, which might just be him again?
That's precise. And actually, you just hit the nail on its head with that last one, the next administration. Putin is just a monolith for now. I mean, he's been in power for 26 years. He knows there's no continuity in American politics. He knows that whatever peace he concludes with Trump, a new broom sweeps clean, as you say, right?
So they can come and...
So he does not find Trump trustworthy, not just on that level of an individual transactionality and idiosyncrasies, but also because chances are we'll have a different, not in 3 years' time, new presidential elections, unless Trump decides to go for his third term. But midterm elections, as you know, the American political history, chances are Democrats may be able to reclaim, if not the Senate, then lower the House of Representatives, and so that will also be lead to a logjam, etc.
So then what happens?
What happens is Donald Trump has not been able to motivate Putin with anything he has up his sleeve, whether renewed sanctions or with any carrots for Putin to unwind this and wind this down and end the war. I don't think Donald Trump has enough leverage with Vladimir Putin. I don't think whatever he offers Putin outweighs the benefits for Putin to continue waging this war, knowing full well that China is behind him. China has been buying Russian resources pretty cheap at a good discount, and Russia has pretty much reoriented its economy towards the east, towards China. So, and China has recently stated, Wang Yi, the foreign minister, said at point blank, we cannot afford to let Russia lose in this war. That's as close as Beijing has gotten to endorsing this. I mean, they say that we're not, supporting this war, but they have Russia's back, and that is that is a crucial, component Putin's decision not to budge to Putin's Trump's wishes. Trump's envoy, as we speak, Witkoff, is back in Moscow. Trump will continue running circles against Trump. Putin is not obviously he's doing just enough not to piss Trump off. To where he gives Ukraine Tomahawk missiles that will allow Ukraine to destroy a few dozen more oil refineries, as Ukraine is doing asymmetrically now. So he's as the consummate kind of a chess player in that sense. Putin is playing this multidimensional chess with Trump. He feels he will outsmart Trump at the end, or outlast him for sure. So this is where we are at. No motivation for Putin to end this.
So what happens for the next administration?
We'll have to wait for the next administration, as you said. Meanwhile, people will continue dying, unfortunately, because Ukrainians are also convinced that for them to end the war will mean essential capitulation and being subsumed within the Russian project. And it's actually going back to your question about what we would have done differently. The logic of the Russian imperialism is such that no matter what Ukraine would have done differently, the only way to live peacefully in Russia would have been to rejoin Russia as on the level of a republic or an autonomy within Russia. What's wrong with that? I mean, if
you have two choices,
if you had asked me personally, I would have, like back in the 90s or 2000s, or even now, why I was dead set against that. Being a Russian speaker, having relatives in Russia, having no Russophobic, ideas in me, was that Russia as an empire consists of all these different nationalities and groups. It is engaged in war against Chechnya. So being a part of that, you would have automatically taken part in these wars of conquest, of putting down rebellion and, in Chechnya that resulted in the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives. I did not want Ukraine to be a part of that bloody imperial or post-imperial project. That's all.
But then on the other side, you have never-ending war.
Now we are. That's where I mean. But even then, let's see how this will end. How the twists and turns of this story. Because a lot of people in Ukraine will tell you this too, that they're glad this thing happened. For the first time, Ukrainians got this sense of identity, and you'll hear that from Ukrainians a lot. That who's the father of Ukrainian nationhood and identity? That's Vladimir Putin. He is the one that actually brought this about. Otherwise it would have been this sort of wishy-washy kind of neither here nor there. So a lot of people will tell you that this may not be so bad. Once again, we'll have to see
until you're the one who gets shot.
And then also perversely, also people on the front lines of informational wars, etc. I'm talking about incentivization as well here, not to be too cynical. They've also grown in stature when this war ended. Let's be very honest, since we're having this kind of a frank, self-searching, soul-searching conversation. I mean, I've, in a way, benefited, as terrible as it sounds, but I've been, as much as I hate what the other side is doing to us, I benefited from it personally. First of all, I've been lucky I haven't been killed, and I've gotten as much exposure. I could never have dreamed of this exposure as a media personality since this war started, because you're the story number one. You get invited to Al Jazeera, CNN, BBC, you travel, you travel as Mr. Ukraine, you represent something that is historical, right? And considering that these people are the ones that shape public opinion, you can say cynically that war kind of perpetuates itself because there's a class of people interested in its continuation. I want to think about myself as someone, I don't want this exposure because it comes at this steep price of a calamity in your home. So it's this sort of perverse incentivization. But I have people, and even friends, some of mine who are living elsewhere, who are accusing me of being, kind of almost like a mercenary, like you're garnering likes, you have this exposure. It's almost like I'm guilty of this war. You see, that's the extreme to which.
Maybe benefiting from the war.
Huh?
I think the it's not guilty, but more benefiting from.
Not financially.
No. What I mean, benefit
because
again,
of this. Because this is just to say how these things are always more complex, and they're always more than meets the eye. There's all these shades of gray, and how people are incentivized to, to continue this. Putin is interested in continuing this war, and Zelensky's detractors are saying that this allows him to stay in power indefinitely, precisely because there cannot be any elections, because the war, does not allow for holding elections, and that's the Russian side is using it to.
Can I ask you a last question now?
Yes.
This is Russia obviously has the means to raise Kiev to the ground, right? Yes.
That's what Trump said a few months ago.
Again, there's a reason.
You think they're holding off on some
I do.
landmark areas and some things they don't want to make? They've bombed children's hospitals. They've bombed
yes.
Cathedrals that like you said, that actually bring us together. The Eastern Orthodox cathedrals.
So one of the things that I wonder, right, is it almost, and that's maybe the 3D chess that everyone's playing on Ukrainian lives. Because it's not one person playing. The West is not giving you enough weapons to really be fully effective. But the Russians also seem to me they're not using the full might of.
The full might, let's face it, nuclear bomb.
Yes. They're not.
In that sense, they could obliterate not just Kiev, but London and Paris.
So they're not using the full might.
Right.
So then it almost seems like a game. Like it's a game of, and it almost reminds me of the Cold War, where, the Russians would go and fight the Americans in Afghanistan. The Afghanis would die. The Americans would be okay. The Russians back home would be okay. These proxy wars. And it kind of seems like what we're in one is just that. It's a proxy war. Everyone's fighting. They're not really fighting against the Ukrainians. They're actually fighting against the Americans, and the Americans are really fighting against the Russians. And you guys are just in the middle. And at a very human level, that's terrible. That's a terrible place to be in, where you are just in the middle of two monsters. And there's I don't know if it's an African saying or when two elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. And as someone whose country has gone through something similar, when the French looked at what Rwanda was, and they said, they saw us within a prism of geopolitical significance or whatever, and they acted in a certain way that was not very human. I kind of feel that that's what's happening to the folks back home, and I feel nothing but pain. I'm very aware of war. Rwandans are very aware of that, much more than maybe some of these other, Malawi. And I certainly hope that smarter minds figure out a way to end this, because from what you're telling me, the likelihood of me sitting 2 years from now watching, Al Jazeera or CNN or Rwanda television and seeing missiles falling in Kiev is much more likely than seeing children going to school safe and mothers playing, shopping and dads going to work. And it really is truly unfortunate. It's a tragedy. And I'm hopeful that, some of the work that you're trying to do and trying to bring a human face to it, will maybe I don't know, in a small way, bring people together. Because I'm sorry, we cannot afford this. It's too risky. Nuclear war is not something that will affect only Ukraine. It would also affect Africa. It's just a terrible situation, and it's really unfortunate that
No,
your
I
people.
appreciate the words of sympathy. Just in closing, I'll say that, I agree with you that this current formula is not workable not even in the long term, but in the near term. Just that's what you're saying. Just keeping it on the kind of a certain level where Ukraine will not fall, but will not be able to prevail in this is to the detriment of all Ukrainians and also to the Europeans themselves. It will bite them in the ass severely. The very idea, if we're talking about a European liberal democratic project, or if we're not talking about the liberal democracy anymore, Oswald Spengler had that 2-volume work, the fall of the Western world. He prophesied it back in 150 years ago. We're back to square one with this. Europe will lose its geopolitical positions quite dramatically if it just continues the same policy of neither here nor there. There has to be a different formula of how to resolve this conflict, especially if you're not willing to send your troops to fight right on the ground. That means you don't have the same skin in the game. And when you said, I will just take one issue, when you said characterize this as a proxy war, well, maybe proxy on the other side, you can make that argument. But Russia has skin in the game. It's not proxy for Russia. They're very much in this war, and increasingly its allies, like North Korea, for example. The West has shown no appetite to loss of life. And if that equation holds, then I agree with you. We have to find a different formula.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Peter, for joining me on the long form.
True pleasure.
It was an absolute pleasure, and I hope you enjoy your Uganda trip.
I hope so too, and I just wish to extend an invitation to you when you have a chance to come to Ukraine. I'll be more than happy to assist you with your meetings. You'll have plenty of very satisfying, conversations there. I guarantee you.
Maybe when things are not so hot, but I've seen that Kiev is very beautiful in summer.
Even now, I mean, it's just I think it's a historical moment. If you have chances are you'll survive.
Chances,
but I can't guarantee it. I can't guarantee.
Yeah. Thank you so much for
Thank
joining
you.
me.
And that's a wrap for this week's episode. Thank you so much for sticking with us until the very end. I'd actually love to hear your thoughts on today's conversation. So drop a comment below and join the discussion. You can also join us on the social media of your choice. And if you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to share it with a friend and invite them to the conversation. I'll see you next time. Until then, take care.
Thank you, Kigali Marriott Hotel, for providing a venue for the long-form podcast to record. At the heart of Kigali's hospitality, Kigali Marriott offers everything from luxury stays to premier event spaces, fine dining, and top-tier conference facilities. Keep up with them at Kigali Marriott on socials and visit their website, www.marriott.com.